Good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 26th of March, 2025. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Charles Malet, and joining me in the studio today is Mike Robinson. Welcome to the programme, Mike. I've also got Vanessa, Beeley and Carl Czar joining by video link. Now, later in the programme, we'll be looking at the Israel-Turkey situation, kicking China out of Panama, and also Palantir's latest adventures. But we're going to begin with what I would describe perhaps as an attack on both sea and air. And this is because the Department for Transport published yesterday the latest assault on systems which work relatively well. This time, seafaring is the victim with the release of the Maritime Decarbonisation Strategy. It sets off on the same foot as the majority of such government output by creating a solution to a problem for which there is scant or no evidence. The strategy grandly claims to be setting out, quote, the best evidence and pathways towards maritime emission reduction goal of zero fuel life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, with at least a 30% reduction by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2040. Relative to 2008 levels. So a lot of jargon, gobbledygook, and rather confusing language there. Now, they're fairly thin on commitments. Indeed, they belie the fact that the entire premise of the document and its proposed outcomes rest on modelling, which may need to be updated on a regular basis. Among the subjects raised, and this really is not an early April Fool, is the assistance that wind may give to a vessel at sea. Indeed, here is the BBC apparently reinventing the sail just last year. Now, the document does concede that the maritime contribution to transport emissions is just 5%, but this is considered enough to completely destroy the system based, as I say, on modelling. Now, given the precarious position in which we find ourselves with regard to food security and the fact that over 90% of imported food comes by sea, tinkering with the delivery mechanism would appear to be reckless in the extreme or deliberately destructive. Now, other points to note are the relationship with the rebranded Infrastructure Bank, now referred to as the National Wealth Fund, and the tie-in with the nascent and seemingly pointless GB Energy, which I spoke about last week. GB Energy reckons on delivering a possible 5% contribution of grid energy, but only if the sun shines and the wind blows, and with an £8.3 billion ticket attached to it. So it's no surprise to see it enmeshed with this scheme to dismantle the effectiveness of the sea lines of communication. On that note, there's no reference to the Royal Navy yet, but presumably it can only be a matter of time. Now, to illustrate the absurdity of the strategy, this graph shows the projected decline of the use of so-called fossil fuels to almost zero by 2050. But, as usual, the devil is to be found in the detail. Now, this fancy diagram shows all the many convoluted ways in which technology and innovation will deliver some sort of magic outcome, but I suspect we're not meant to look too closely, for if we do, we will see that it does not quite stack up. In the attempt to remove carbon dioxide from maritime activity, the strategy is unequivocal that there will be a massive increase in dangerous pollutants such as nitrous oxide and some sulfur oxides. The document states that nitrous oxide and ammonia are particularly harmful for human and animal health, and we may require policies that ensure solutions are implemented, end quote, before going on to state that, quote, these processes could have further harmful effects on health and the environment. For example, ammonia can cause eutrophication, acidification, and stratospheric ozone depletion, end quote. Added to this, of course, is the ever-present caveat that carbon may be offset either by paying more or by involvement in some sort of auction process, which would appear to undermine the entire pretext of the scheme. So we should expect considerable pushback. And I would say if you are involved in maritime trade, then this is a heads up for you, but it would be excellent to hear your views. So please do get in touch. Now, aligned with this, and as reported back in November, is the increase in air passenger duty slated to change next month. and we can see that costs for the passenger will go up across the board. And it must not be forgotten that it's the government which says that we expect the measure to have a negligible impact on the environment. So this is really the agenda being delivered in plain sight. And as always, the taxpayer is set to pick up the tab. There's been plenty of focus on 15-minute cities and low-traffic neighbourhoods, but the reality, I think, is that this will go far further, and certainly something we can talk about more in Extra. It will also become relevant, I think, in the next report, although I won't go on to talk about that. And you're going to be flying next month. Have you got any thoughts on this and indeed sort of sea travel and the threat to it?
It is incredible that we are seriously in the 21st century looking at sticking sail. And I appreciate they're not cloth sails, but nonetheless, effectively sails on cargo vessels, replacing diesel with biofuel. Well, you're talking about food security. Using food product to produce fuel to transport food seems like, I mean, I don't even know where to go with it. It's absolutely unbelievable.
I suppose there's a little bit of efficiency in that photograph shown of the BBC with the new vessel enhanced with its sails. It turns out those sails are in fact made from wind turbine material, so not a total waste, perhaps.
Well, otherwise they would be going into landfill, right?
Yeah, well, exactly, and will presumably at some point. Now, as I say, we'll talk about this more in Extra. You've run a couple of interviews with Carl Czar recently, and it's now time to introduce Carl to the programme, but Mike, you've got a few words to say first.
Well, over the last few weeks, Mark Anderson has been reporting Donald Trump's comments about the Panama Canal, so let's just bring this on screen and just so that everybody knows where Panama is. Of course, he's been talking about or making the point that Panama, he said, he did not sell to China. He had sold the Panama Canal to Panama, not to China. And so he was pretty upset with the fact, at least that was his rhetoric, that China had so much influence in the area. So apparently then, out of nowhere, out of the blue, at the beginning of March, CK Hutchison Holdings, which is based in Hong Kong, announced that it had agreed to sell control of a unit operating ports associated with the Panama Canal to a consortium, including BlackRock, Global Infrastructure Partners, and Terminal Investment Limited. So let me say hello to Carl and welcome you to the program. What's the detail on this, Carl, and how has China responded to it?
Mike, it's good to see you. And right now, this is a big deal. CK Hutchison is one of the biggest multinational company based in Hong Kong. And since 1997, it has controlled both ports at both ends of Panama Canal. This has been a talking point by many in the United States national security circles as China's influence in Panama. Now, Chinese government is actually very upset at this surprising deal that was announced. The pro-Beijing newspaper Da Gongbao, based in Hong Kong, has lashed out at this deal and calling Li Ka-shing, the Hong Kong billionaire who owns CK Hutchison, has been spinelessly groveling to the Trump administration. But in a way, this also shows that China, in fact, do not control CK Hutchison as a company, because if they do, they could have just told them no deal or the deal is off. The current deal is structured. CK Hutchison is going to sell 43 ports in 23 countries, including 2 ports in Panama, but also their ports on Suez Canal. Very strategic, vital geopolitical strangleholds to a BlackRock group led consortium, and the deal is brokered by Goldman Sachs. So this is a great PR victory for the Trump administration, because Trump claimed that he has reclaimed Panama Canal from China, and in doing so, he's handing a very sweetheart deal to his buddies in the Wall Street, to the people in the Goldman Sachs and BlackRock. Now, China is upset because this would set a bad precedence for Chinese companies bending under pressure from U.S. government decree, especially coming up in April, there's a forced sale of TikTok. U.S. Congress passed a law that TikTok must sell to American company by April or cease to operate on American soil. So if with the CK Hutchison deal goes through, this set a very bad example for other Chinese companies to follow, especially with TikTok forced sale date that's coming up. This is why, Chinese government is voicing its displeasure at CK Hutchison, probably for not informing them of the deal beforehand, but also structure the deal in such a way it does not allow enough time for a third party to come in with a bid. So Chinese government actually don't have a time to organize a counter bid to this right now. And this is why they're understandably upset. But for Trump, this demonstrate another one of his great victory, to reclaim American greatness.
The South China Morning Post here is saying that China has now sent a delegation to Panama after the port deal, and in the headline here it's saying Belt and Road exit. And I suppose my next question is, what is the likely outcome of this for the Belt and Road initiative?
That's a great question. Well, another Trump claim victory is that it forced Panama government to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative with China. Again, this is a PR victory because Panama, since its last president, has canceled all the Belt and Road Initiative project with China, most importantly, a $4 billion high-speed rail project. So currently, there's actually no Belt and Road Initiative project in Panama. So it's very easy for Panamanian government to claim that they are withdrawing from BRI when in fact there's nothing going on. And it's an easy PR victory for the Trump administration also, because they can claim another victory over China, another victory of America reclaiming the Panama Canal, and for the Panamanian government to curry favor with the Trump administration, saying, okay, we're doing as we have been told. We are towing your line.
So some of the coverage that I saw in Chinese language media and the translation services do a very good job of translating it. The language that was being used was really aggressive. I mean, betrayal, treason, this kind of thing. Are there going to be any repercussions for Hutchison and its chief executive?
Well, this is interesting part because Hutchison sold all its overseas ports, but they're retaining all the ports that they operate in China and Hong Kong. So they're actually, what they're doing is, from purely business standpoint, they're reducing their geopolitical risk. They didn't want to get caught in between a geopolitical competition between China and United States. And all its overseas ports, both in Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, could be subject to possible U.S. sanctions. And China has chose to not publicly attack CK Hutchison through its official state media. I'm talking about Xinhua, I'm talking about People's Daily or CCTV. Instead, it used a kind of the proxy media. It's a pro-Beijing newspaper in Hong Kong by voicing its concerns, and then having China's top liaison office in Hong Kong reposting this article, while the Chinese government itself had refrained from publicly naming the owner of CK Hutchison, which is the Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing. And Li Ka-shing's youngest son actually is recently in Beijing attending a business forum attended by many global leaders, including American Tim Cook, who get to meet with Xi Jinping. So I'm sure there's some kind of backroom deal that's being worked out. And so far, a lot of the blame the Beijing official media had placed on the Trump administration for unilaterally pressuring private business to conform to unreasonable American demands.
Carl, obviously I've just given a report on shipping, or at least the effect that this ridiculous strategy that the UK government's proposing. But of course, not just the UK, the whole of Europe is very much dependent upon freight coming into it from other parts of the world. The Panama Canal will be therefore very strategically important. But Western governments and indeed their media are predisposed to be in opposition to both Donald Trump and China. What's your sense of the response from Europe, the governments of Europe, the European Union, and the media?
I mean, right now, with the new Trump administration, the European foreign policy is in shambles. It's a lot of the European leaders are kind of running around like headless chickens. They're talking about continuing the proxy war in Ukraine without United States. They're talking about possibly forming a security pact without U.S. I mean, this is very ridiculous talk. And the fact that they are now being placed under tariffs by the Trump administration, on one hand, on other hand, they want to continue the same policy they follow under the Biden administration, which is to be aggressive toward China in terms of trade. It just does not make sense. I mean, Europe is not really piloting a third way here. There's a real opportunity for Europe to have its own independent foreign policy that serves European interests. Yet for some odd reasons, the European leaders decide not to do that, but follow the same failed neoliberal foreign policy that was under the Biden administration, even though the tune has changed in Washington. This is something maybe you can help me to understand. Why is the European leader persist in such self-defeating ways?
Because they're off their heads, Carl, but we'll talk about that in extra.
We'll try to get to the bottom of that extra if we perhaps extend it somewhat. Carl, thanks very much indeed. And Vanessa will now move across to the Middle East and to Yemen.
Yes, where, of course, Yemen and Iran, where Trump has reignited the war against Yemen in defense of the security of Israel while it's recommitting a slightly paused genocide against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And effectively, under the first Trump administration, Trump scuppered the nuclear deal. He's now threatening Iran with war, effectively, if they don't rejoin negotiations for the nuclear deal that he effectively got rid of under his first administration. And of course, the supreme leadership in Iran is pushing back very hard and saying that they don't agree to negotiations with what is effectively a bully in the United States, particularly under President Trump. So what's actually happening? We're seeing a massive buildup of US military assets, both in West Asia or the Middle East, but also in Diego Garcia base, which I'll talk about more and explain exactly where it is. So first of all, we've got second aircraft carrier to the Middle East. Basically, there's already the USS Harry Truman, which will extend its deployment in the Red Sea for the war against Yemen. Now, the USS Carl Vinson and accompanying destroyers will join in the coming weeks. But not only this, there are F-35 fighters heading towards Israel. The Gold Refueling Group has confirmed that they're towing a pair of F-35 fighters into Israel. And further deployments in the Middle East continue. That's being reported across the board from the various open source intelligence agencies on social media. But then, in particular, we've seen US C-17 cargo carriers. We can just have a look at that, cargo planes flying into the Diego Garcia bases. Now, the C-17s are troop carriers and will be used to carry cargo to operating bases. Then finally, and this is probably the most sinister move by the United States, which is the bringing in of B-2 Spirit or stealth bombers. If we can just have a look at that again, these are coming into Diego Garcia. And we're hearing numbers between 4 to 7 B-2 Spirit bombers. Now, what's interesting, these bombers in particular have been used to deploy bunker buster bombs that, of course, are designed to target the underground weapon facilities, potentially, in this case, in Iran, but they also have the capability to carry nuclear weapons. So this is where this becomes extremely dangerous as regards escalation. Where is Diego Garcia? Well, it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's actually a British base that has been leased to the United States for 99 years. It's a base which is shrouded in secrecy. I'll come on to that at the end. But if we have a quick look at the tag, so the Indian Ocean island was notably used as a primary launch pad for bomber strikes in the opening phases of Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan 2001, Operation Iraqi Freedom. I love this use of the word freedom by the United States. In 2003, and actually against Serbia by NATO in 1999. It's very important to note here, this is from the article, that Diego Garcia, unlike bases in the Middle East or aircraft carriers operating in the region, is largely out of the reach of the missiles and drones available now to either Ansarullah or Iran. Iran's current longest range ballistic missiles are generally assessed to have maximum ranges around 1,242 miles. However, I have to say in the last 48 hours, Iran has unveiled missiles that have a range of 1,700 miles, and they've also unveiled new underground military development centers and bases and missile launch centers. And the three disputed islands at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, which directly threaten actually the Gulf states. So clearly Iran is responding to Trump's military escalation with their own version of a military escalation against what Trump is progressing with. This is actually back in 2015, April 2015, a bombing of the Faj Atan mountain in Yemen using the B-2 bombers, just to give people an idea of the bombs that will be deployed by these bombers. And the bomber itself, the B-2 bomber, costs $1 billion to make. So the fact that 7 of those bombers, I think there's only 22 in existence, and now being moved to Diego Garcia is a strong signal from Trump. Now, coming on to a BBC article that I found this morning, which was kind of interesting. This was what I found on the secretive tropical island they don't want you to see. Now, why I say this is interesting, what does the BBC talk about? It talks about the fact that, of course, Mauritius, which won independence from the UK in 1968, maintains that the islands are its own, and the UN's highest court has ruled in an advisory opinion that the UK's administration of the territory is unlawful and must end. It is said that the Chagos Island should be handed over to Mauritius in order to complete the UK's decolonisation. Clive Baldwin, senior legal advisor at Human Rights Watch, says the forced displacement of the Chagosians by the UK and US, their persecution on the grounds of race, and the ongoing prevention of their return to their homeland amounts to crimes against humanity. So while explaining that this island is shrouded in secrecy, media is forbidden entry, the BBC apparently had to go through a huge number of hoops to be able to actually get onto the island and be given a very much a guided tour around. Interesting that the security company G4S was sent to accompany them. And all they mention are this basically colonization issue, which is a major issue, but they also talk about the fact that potentially the CIA has black sites on Diego Garcia. But for me, this doesn't explain the extreme secrecy over the military bases on this island, and one wonders what else is being developed there.
Some good questions. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, well, sticking with defence then, the Treasury was tweeting out this message today that national security is the first responsibility of any government, and through boosting our defence sector, we can protect the UK and help grow the economy. Now, Rachel Reeves, of course, today is giving her spring statement, and many, many cuts expected. But let's have a listen to what Rachel Reeves had to say about defence and war this morning.
I'm going to set out in the spring statement increases in defence spending for next year worth £2.2 billion as we take defence spending as a share of our economy to 2.5%. The world is changing. We can see that before our eyes, but we're not a passive government, we're an active one, stepping up our defence capability to keep our country safe and secure, because a strong economy depends on strong defence. But as we invest in our defence, we can also bring more good quality jobs, paying decent wages to communities across our country.
Now, so as Rachel Reeves is busy cutting the heart out of government budgets, and I'm not suggesting that that isn't a good thing in and of itself, but the question is, we can be pretty well assured that the money saved is going straight into bullets and bombs. So maybe that's not such a great thing. In the meantime, King Charles was welcoming British and French war chiefs to Windsor Castle on Monday. And this was all about continuing efforts to build the coalition of the willing. Here's another delightful image with Radican meeting his French counterpart. So they were discussing UK and French efforts to build a European Defence Union, as we've been talking about over the last number of weeks and, in fact, over the last number of years, as well as the growing defence partnership between Britain and France. They're desperate to keep momentum in this EU Defence Union process at the moment, and I just sort of get the feeling that momentum's come out of it a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but nonetheless, if you remember last week, following the so-called high-level meetings in London and Paris, there was an operational planning meeting held at the UK's permanent joint headquarters at Northwood. Now, there's going to be more of these joint planning meetings at Northwood this week, where intensive discussions will continue over several days. And just as an aside here, the Svenska contract of £196 million, you can see on this graphic here, it was initially £196 million. That contract's now been extended to 2031, so I'm not quite sure what the total value of that contract is. Skanska, Swedish company, provides, although it's the UK arm of the Swedish company, provides all the non-military facilities management at Northwood. Which we would remind you contains UK military headquarters, NATO maritime headquarters, and until 2019, EU operations headquarters for EU NAVFOR and other EU projects that we were involved with. Maybe because that was maybe until 2019, because we all know Brexit's not really real in any practical sense. And I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on whether they've actually pulled the infrastructure out of Northwood, or whether we still have hotlines and encryption to Brussels.
I think it would be hard to see that it would be destroyed altogether. That would seem reckless. I think, even if it would be the appropriate thing to do. And actually, that yesterday, Mike Martin, MP, who is ex-army, was asking Luke Pollard, Armed Forces Minister, in a defence committee about, not specifically about this, but concerning government policy around operational security, specifically with regard to the leak in the United States. And it was just interesting to note that Pollard was very vague on exactly what government would do. Mike Martin was talking about a staff sergeant of his in Afghanistan who was sacked for incorrectly changing something from being top secret to secret. And he was just making the analogy. And just with this in mind and this capability, it was just interesting to note that Pollard was very, very evasive on the issue of what exactly would the government policy be. And he was effectively suggesting that, well, it would just be taken on its own merits, depending on who it was and what sort of information. So when you consider that in light of this, I would say, yeah, very opaque.
Yes, indeed. So look, these meetings will also provide an opportunity, the government says, ahead of the UK-France summit later in 2025 for further discussion. And this summit is going to enhance the 2010 Lancaster House Treaties on Security and Defence, which the Ministry of Defence says already provide the UK and France with, quote, a firm foundation of in-depth military cooperation unmatched between European partners. It's unclear how the Lancaster House Treaties could be enhanced because the then Prime Minister David Cameron and French President Nicolas Sarkozy signed two so-called defence treaties at 10 Downing Street following the summit held at Lancaster House. No debate was held in Parliament, and these treaties took us into a 50-year defence pact with France. Now, why is this important? Well, one reason is that the Franco-British axis has been driving this EU defence union policy since 1984, and we can imagine an EU nuclear button, can we imagine an EU nuclear button in the hands of Ursula von der Leyen? We can probably appreciate the problem that might cause. Now, the Wall Street Journal, and thanks to Vanessa for popping this through to me, published this article yesterday. Trump prompts European calls for a homegrown nuclear umbrella, and they're pointing out that Macron has, already held a nuclear drill under the streets of Paris in 2022, which is supposed to send a message to Moscow. They're highlighting the Trump's alleged cooling on NATO as the excuse for driving this. A European deterrent, nuclear deterrent they're talking about, led by France and the UK, could be problematic because of legal, political and technical difficulties. That Germany, Poland and Denmark are already showing interest, but that sharing nuclear weapons means sharing sovereignty. Well, that's the sovereignty issue is something that we've highlighted with European Defence Union for a long time. And that they're pointing out again that Britain's nuclear arsenal failed tests, the dependence on the United States for maintenance and even for the missiles in the first place, and so on. So, the huge cost of this to provide this so-called nuclear blanket over Europe is nuts. And the final point was compliance with the non-proliferation treaty. Well, at the moment, they're already setting us up for that because they're accusing Russia of being in breach of the non-proliferation treaty already. So maybe they don't need to worry about that bit. We'll keep you posted on this, but it is a developing story. We'll see whether the momentum has actually come out of it or whether they can keep it going for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, just quickly on Russia, I think it does telegraph a couple of things. First of all, that there is a high state of unreadiness for war. Yes. And secondly, if there really is a threat, then what on earth is Putin waiting for? I mean, if he really is to invade the entirety of Western Europe, then surely he would have done it by now, before there has been a chance to put all this in place.
Well, indeed, good point. Okay, let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does, you'd like to support us, please go to support.ukcolumn.org. There are options there. You could make a donation. You can join as a member. If you do join as a member, you can get access to UK Column News Extra. Pick up something from the shop, helps us as well. Or from clive2carl.com, we get a small commission if you buy something from him through the link on that page. But if you can't do any of that, please do at least share the material you find on the UK Column website. Share buttons are there. We do need your help to deal with the censorship situation, and so any sharing does absolutely help us greatly. Tickets almost gone now for UK Column on Location, which is on Saturday the 5th of April in Cheltenham. Catherine Gunn, Alex Thompson, Patrick Henningsen, Raja Mia and Brian Gerrish all speaking at that. UK Column Q&A will be part of that, I'm quite sure, as well. If you want to get a ticket, you need to get it very, very soon. But if you can't join us in person, you can at least join us on the live stream. So the live stream is available now on the UK Column shop if you'd like to go and pick up a ticket for that.
And I think just to make it clear, with a live stream ticket, even if you can't watch it as it's going out, you will have access to it afterwards. So even if you can't sit down and watch it on the 5th of April, do please consider getting a ticket because you will have access to it thereafter.
Absolutely. Yesterday's interview with on moral courage and what is required, stopping sexual indoctrination in school with Hugh McCarthy is available on the UK Column website. And tomorrow at 1 p.m, Ben is speaking to Raja Mia, and he is, of course, against near overwhelming opposition from Oldham Council, is galvanising local support and local community to disrupt the local party machinery. And Raja will be speaking at the conference as well. So he'll be talking about how they are unseating Labour councillors in particular in that part of the world. So join Ben and Raja at 1 p.m. tomorrow if you can. Now, let's move on then to Palantir. Well, just before we get to that, let's just talk about the Data Use and Access Bill, because this continues its way through Parliament at the moment. It's gone through the committee stage, and it's about to go to the report stage, although there's no firm date for that just yet. In the meantime, The COVID inquiry also rumbles on. And just over a week ago, it entered into evidence a written statement made by Lewis Mosley, who's Executive Vice President of Palantir. And he wrote this statement in January, but it's been published as I say, about a week ago on the website. And in this statement, Mosley had this to say. Common operating system. The UK government needs to invest in a common operating system solution that would sit on top of and be able to integrate with the multitude of source systems across government. In fact, across local and central government, healthcare, and bodies of national strategic importance. In peacetime, he said, this system will be used to improve collaboration between these organizations and to optimize procurement, amongst other things. But in an emergency, the common operating system would be rapidly reconfigured to respond to the crisis at hand. He said HM government must be able to respond to the black swan events. COVID-19 was an airborne disease pandemic, he claimed. But the next national emergency could take a different form. For example, a contact disease, a widespread energy outage, a global supply chain disruption, a nuclear disaster, or a war, for example. What does he know? So this so-called evidence was basically a sales pitch for Palantir, a company which is already way too embedded in the UK national infrastructure and our personal data. So particularly because they're trying very hard to worm their way into the Stargate project in the United States and will be with the equivalent AI project here in the UK. I think this is something that we need to be very much aware of, and I think we should be absolutely calling to get Palantir out of the UK completely. I think that would be my advice. So look, this is the kind of data sharing which the Data Use and Access Bill enables. This piece of legislation is a critical part of the technocracy infrastructure that's being built at the moment, and it needs to be resisted. So I think I would urge that anyone who's not speaking out on this topic really needs to start very, very soon.
Yeah, I quite agree. And I think the sort of kicking out process should not be limited to Palantir. There are a number of organisations now which presumably in a fairly short space of time will have to start competing with one another for control of the data that the government is prepared to hand over to them. I think we can talk about that more in extra, but obviously we've covered many organisations that are now very much integrated with government and our data, and therefore de facto control over our lives. But it's interesting to see how he will weaponize the emergency, be whatever type of emergency it needs to be to push his particular product over the line, exactly like the government and indeed the media might do.
Yeah, and the problem is that government civil servants, they're not technically literate, actually, in most cases, and so they can be drawn into contracts that perhaps the British taxpayer doesn't need to be paying for.
Absolutely, and when we think about your report last week about you called it the UK Doge, the abandonment of the credit cards, presumably to either be replaced by fewer credit cards or some other perhaps digital method of paying for stuff, who knows. But this all seems to be aligned with that, insofar as reform will be to create efficiencies, but also that will bring in organisations exactly like Palantir to be able to claim that very efficiency. Anyway,
yes,
we'll carry on more in extra, I would think.
Absolutely.
Now, we will move on to domestic and agricultural and land affairs now, with the news that Angela Rayner put the Planning and Infrastructure Bill before Parliament on Monday for its second reading. Now, her rhetoric has not abated since the first reading, and it's the very clearest of indicators that the government gives absolutely no regard to the considerations of the public that they're supposed to serve. As an example, Rayner stated that EV, electric vehicle charge points, will have regulations stripped away, with just a permit rather than a license needed. This is because they count as critical infrastructure, a term upon which so much has been hung in the past few years. She reinforced the point that any challenges to proposed government infrastructure projects or large developments will be neutered by amendments to the process, giving only one appeal as opposed to three. In saying that it will slice through the bureaucracy and speed up transport projects. She spoke very dismissively about the meritless cases being dragged through the courts. So there was some pushback, but really only from Conservative MPs, and that makes it abundantly clear that the requirement to represent the views of constituents has evaporated altogether in the House of Commons. It emerged with the result of 330 votes versus 74 for the bill to progress, and not a single Labour vote against. A few contributions are noteworthy, though none was given any consideration by the Deputy Prime Minister. Bradley Thomas, Conservative MP, asked whether 225,000 homes have yet been built, because the Labour government pledged that they would construct 1.5 million of them during this Parliament. That went unanswered. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown said, if we are to override local people, we might just as well have a nationally directed planning system rather than a local planning system. Will she think carefully about that balance? No, of course, she did not commit to thinking about that balance. But the question in itself did indicate that the government can, of course, just override the wishes of the population. Now, as to Rayner herself, I think we would just consider her words here. She said, make no mistake, the bill will transform the lives of working people and Britain's prospects for years to come. Yes, indeed, but I think we'd be minded to interpret her message in a different manner from the one she may have intended. Now, another contributor to the debate was Sir Ashley Fox, and he made an obvious statement, but one that is worth repeating. He said, I'm concerned about the abuse of power, particularly in relation to agricultural land and green spaces. By simplifying land acquisitions and reducing protections for affected landowners, the bill could pave the way for large-scale developments that displace communities, damage the environment, and undermine agricultural interests. I think the only thing I'd fall out with is by saying could pave the way. I should think it would be absolutely certain that it will pave the way. Now, following on from this, we had specific references to compulsory purchase, which brings us on to Natural England, because, of course, reported after the first reading of the bill, it was Natural England that were going to be given power to seize land by compulsory purchase if they, Natural England, required it. So here we see that Tony Juniper, the chair of Natural England for a very long period of time, has just been reappointed, which is significant. Not least because he's presided over the unaccountable land grabbing that's been going on, especially via designation of sites of special scientific interest, which Sandy spoke about recently, but also because of his close friendship and working relationship with the King, with whom he has co-authored books and, of course, actively promoted the drive towards 50% of land and sea to be in nature recovery by 2050 under the Terra Carta. Now, from Natural England, we move to the Animal and Plant Health Agency and inevitably biosecurity, the marketing of which reaches new bounds every day. Here's a reference to what is being described as an emergency response to reports of foot and mouth in Germany. Now, regardless of what you think about any diagnosis of such a disease, there is no debate about whether animals recover from it. They do recover, and it is well documented. As the government says, foot and mouth disease poses no risk to human or food safety, but is a highly contagious viral disease of cattle, sheep, pigs, and other cloven-hoofed animals. So we're obviously still supposed to be in fear, and we're still supposed to consider it is proportionate to slaughter on suspicion, and that leads us back to bird flu, but this time in sheep. This is the Australian broadcaster ABC reporting here that the news has sparked biosecurity warning even in Australia, and this, of course, links back to the chief vet, Christine Middlemiss, whose last job was in New South Wales, where she led the charge for a new and very stringent biosecurity regime, which critically conferred responsibility for it onto the population at large, saying it was effectively a community issue and everybody bore some sort of responsibility for it. Now, here is Christine Middlemiss speaking on BBC Farming Today this morning about the peril that we're in.
We don't think there's increased risk if there's not a clear pathway. So I wouldn't be worrying about necessarily being near a poultry farm, but don't leave open sheep feed if you can avoid it, where wild birds can come along and they have bird droppings in the feed and then the sheep eats them. These sorts of things are important to be aware of.
How worried are you that there has been a case in sheep, full stop?
Well, this is our surveillance working. We have a risk-based programme and it said, well, there is risk and we found one sheep and the other sheep are negative. So that actually is quite comforting that we have a programme in place and it's doing what we asked it to do. And they say the risk to general public remains as low. And additionally, Food Standards Agency say the risk to the general public is very low.
So at the same time, the risk to the public is low, but we should be worried, and it cannot affect you, but it can at the same time. It's all very confusing. And of course, given what she said, is it in fact just possible that sheep could come into contact with wild bird droppings that are not necessarily in stocks of feed, like those that might be found in the middle of fields? So the whole narrative is, of course, patently absurd. It certainly seems to have set Mike off, but it does illustrate the part that confirmation bias will be allowed to play now that this so-called surveillance will move to species in proximity to poultry birds. And it's beyond question that if you want to find it, you only need to test for it. And then it's of no consequence at all whether there is any discernible or observable disease. Now, to round off this report, we're going to look at pesticides and the way in which language is manipulated by the government at every turn. So this is the recently announced and much vaunted Pesticides National Action Plan, referred to here by the Fresh Produce Journal. Sorry, I've skipped ahead. But we're supposed to take away the message that pesticide use will be reduced by 10%. By, of course, none other than 2030. But if you look closely, you'll see that this is not what's being said at all. And the text highlighted there in the red box on screen says that UK governments will support farmers to increase their use of sustainable farming practices to reduce the potential harm from pesticides by 10% by 2030. So, in fact, it's not a reduction of pesticide use. It is exactly like carbon offsetting. It's a form of stated mitigation based on modelling, no doubt, which doesn't do what we're supposed to believe it does. Now, of course, the other thing to note is it doesn't make any mention of herbicides or fungicides or of their consequences on the environment and the food chain. And I should point out, no, there wasn't been time today, but I will be dealing specifically with glyphosate herbicide in the coming weeks. So that takes us back to Vanessa and what's been going on in Turkey.
Well, actually, it's more about the potential for Israeli-Turkey conflict inside Syria, for influence inside Syria. So first of all, we'll look at what the two countries perceive as their agenda or their right in Syria. First of all, Erdogan, Turkey, very much a backer of if we can just have the slide, of the HTS Al-Qaeda factions inside Syria that have taken control of Damascus since the 8th of December, are conducting ethnic cleansing programs in pretty much all of Syria. But Erdogan advocates for a unified and stable nation, inclusive of all societal groups, which of course means that he has control of all of Syria, because Syria will be controlled by HTS and the Syrian National Army, which is the former Free Syrian Army, all under control of Turkey, and of course aligned also with Qatar, another controller of the Muslim Brotherhood factions inside Syria. But let's have a look now at what Israel perceives as its agenda in Syria. And of course, Israel is very much along the lines of the clean break doctrine from 1997, which talks about the fragmentation of the region into smaller states. And basically, Israel is using the persecution of the Alawites, the Druze sects, and the Kurds in Syria to create statelets, which will effectively still be under the control of Israel acting as proxies of Israel. And of course, we know now that Russia is effectively in discussions with Israel over Russia consolidating its military bases in the coastal area, red area there, and potentially taking control of that partitioned segment, which would, in inverted commas, give protection for the Alawites that are currently being slaughtered by the Taxpayer project, very much of Turkey, although it's a little bit more complex than that. Now, what has been happening recently, we've talked about the fact that Russia and Israel might align to push back against Turkish expansionism in Syria and in the region. But what's happening more recently is that it's actually escalated beyond that. So we've seen, this is a report in my Zionist think tank, in Syria, Turkish presence in military airports and aerial friction with Israel. So what does this actually mean? Yesterday, Israel bombed an area of Syria to the east of Homs, Palmyra and the T4 military base, which were former Syrian Arab Army air bases and military bases. But the red line there shows Israel's potential David corridor, which will extend from the south area, we've talked about it before, the east border with Jordan and Iraq, and eventually Iraq links with the Kurdish settlement in the east and arrive at the Euphrates in Iraq. This is your plan. So on these two military bases. Now, what is more interesting is that Turkey needs its own base to these bases.
Right, Vanessa, I'm really sorry, but your connection is just breaking up so badly that we can't actually. Give us a quick sound check.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, no, we can't. So look, why don't you try to restart the connection, and we'll cover another topic, and then we'll come back to this.
Right. Thanks for bearing with us. We'll see if we can get Vanessa later.
Sorry, hold on a second. Let's Vanessa say something.
Is that any better?
That is better. Yes. Okay. So where were we?
Okay. Sorry, we're back to internet problems.
Okay. Yes. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. So what is interesting is that Turkey has been moving its own military advisors into these bases to develop military capability for HTS, for the factions it should have control of a unified Syria. And then if we look at another article that has been published recently, Israel and Turkey on collision course in Syria after Palmyra airstrikes. So again, this points out the fact that Israel was effectively potentially targeting Turkish military in former Syrian Arab army bases in this area. And then from the article, a quote from Nimrod Goran from the Mitveen Institute. Unlike Turkey, which supports a strong, centralized and stable Syria, Israel at the moment appears to prefer Syria fragmented, with the belief that it could better bolster Israel's security. So confirmation there. And Netanyahu today put out an announcement that he was to convene a security meeting over Turkish involvement in Syria. So as I said, we seem to be heading to at least some degree of contestation over Syrian territory between Israel and Turkey. And I'm quite sure that the destabilization currently ongoing in Turkey is no coincidence on that basis also. And then in the south, what has Israel been doing? Again, it's been expanding and advancing. This is a headline in the Jerusalem Post today. The IDF engages in firefight with so-called terrorists in southern Syria. In reality, Israel is trying to expand its land grab in the south, and it was pushed back by local fighters in the areas where it's trying to advance. They are now, of course, termed terrorists. And if we have a quick look at the map, you can see the two areas that I'm talking about that were under attack. First of all, in the south there, in a village called Zawaya, west of Dara, that is where Israel is advancing and entrenching, and the bombing of those bases, as I said, in central Syria, which again also demonstrates the extent to which Turkey is also trying to expand into central Syria. And at the same time, in Hymamim, Russia is moving greater numbers of troops into Hymamim under the pretext of protecting its own convoys. There are more than 7,000 Syrian Alawites that have gathered in the Hymamim base for protection. And in fact, the military hardware is being built up around the base. Now, yes, it could be protection for Russian convoys. It could also be the start of that consolidation of Russian military presence in the coastal area and the providing of that pretext of protection for the Alawites and the Christians and even the Sunnis that are opposed to the Taxpayer project. So very fluid, a lot of swapping and changing of alliances in order to consolidate power inside Syria with, in my opinion, very little regard for the actual Syrian people, which I guess is pretty normal.
And you think Israel will be involved in some way in this destabilization within Turkey itself?
I think it's too much of a coincidence that it's been kicked off now. I do also think that there's potential that Erdogan is playing a part in this, because by creating the instability, he can bring in emergency law, which then potentially would allow him to make changes in the constitution to extend his presidency beyond the next 3 years, which he's currently not able to do. And also it scuppers the deal with the PKK, the Kurdish so-called terrorist factions, that he was in the process of negotiating. He may well not want that to go through because, of course, it's the Kurdish separatist factions that are under the control of Israel and the US in the northeast that potentially would become that autonomous region linked with Israel. So it's very messy at the moment, and I think a lot of things don't add up. A lot of things are not as they appear initially. So I do think that destabilization that is ongoing in Turkey has a lot to do with what is going on in Syria, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Now, we'll just move to free speech, or at least something that's being hailed as a case about free speech. And this is the news that the Office for Students has handed down a fine of £585,000 to the University of Sussex for apparently infringing free speech. Now, they said back in 2021, when the investigation began, that the investigation is focused on whether or not the university has met its obligations for academic freedom and freedom of speech within the law for all students and staff, whatever their views. And they go on to say that students are entitled to be taught by academic staff with a wide range of views and who can freely express lawful views, no matter how controversial they are, without fear of losing their jobs or privileges. All students and staff are also entitled to the protections offered by equality legislation, and these must extend to all protected characteristics, including philosophical beliefs. Well, the range of interviews that Diane has been running, I think, would contradict that statement insofar as academics who've spoken out are actually concerned. But at the heart of this is that the University of Sussex was said to have promoted transgender ideology with a policy requirement to, quote, positively represent trans people, end quote, and a prohibition on what was described as transphobic propaganda. Now, this has been effectively rebutted to a certain extent by Sasha Rosnell, the Vice-Chancellor, who has written an article here at Politics Home. And her point is that the university, in actual fact, itself was backing Kathleen Stock, who is the professor at the heart of this, and indeed that there is much more to it than meets the eye. And she's describing it as being an exercise in political scapegoating. So I think there's definitely more to come out there. With regard to how this has actually affected the university itself, or indeed what the mood is there, this is taken from the Student Union website and their gender inclusive language policy, and they say, to quote from their policy, pronouns must be stated at the beginning of every meeting, even if they've been stated at previous meetings. Gender neutral language must be used where an individual's pronouns are not known. So the student body very much minded towards a position that meant that Kathleen Stock and indeed her views and indeed her writings were not going to be tolerated. And Kathleen Stock herself, a tweet or her Twitter account shown on screen there, who's also a contributing editor to Unheard, has said that she will be writing about this in due course, in effect to set the record straight. There seems to be much more to it than meets the eye, not least because the investigation took over 3 years and a lot of the process that should have been followed wasn't. So this will be one to follow. So whilst on the surface, this does appear to be about free speech, that there may well be other issues at play. So it might not be, or rather it could be a little bit too early to chalk it up as a victory for free speech. Now, that brings us to the end of the news programme today. So thank you to Vanessa and Carl for joining, and of course for Mike being in the studio with me today. Now, don't forget the interview with Roger Meir going out tomorrow at 1:00. Also, please do buy a ticket to the live stream for our UK Column on Location event on Saturday, the 5th of April, and tell your friends and indeed anybody else that you bump into. And otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you at 1:00 on Friday, unless you're a UK Column member, in which case please hang around for extra in 10 minutes or so. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.